All right, welcome back for the fifth grade economics overview. We are diving in tonight at those fifth grade standards and looking at them. Here we go. In order to be successful, we always want to start with this. In social study, as learners in each grade, it is imperative that students have gained that fundamental understanding through the prior years of social studies curriculum. Your lessons and support for the social studies curriculum directly impacts your students' success in their education. So, in fifth grade, students will understand the financial implications of governmental and personnel choices that led to the American Revolution. Students will also understand the roles of each colony in production and supply and the impact of the Continental Army's success in the American Revolution. Our standards start as overviews here. We have quite a few in fifth grade, unlike our prior two grades. So, in fifth grade, it is imperative that students will be able to compare the benefits and costs of the governmental and individual choices leading up to the revolution, that they will be able to identify resources that were used to produce goods and services within colonial settlements, the New England, Middle, and Southern, that they will be able to compare the reasons for different areas of specialization in trade among individuals and businesses in New England, Middle, and Southern colonies, that they will analyze how the skills and strengths of the African diaspora influenced economic specialization in the colonies, and that they will describe the role of money and currency in colonial America. And lastly, that students will be able to explain that the economic interdependence between the colonies during the American Revolution. So, as always, we are a collaborative learning community. So, please feel free to contribute standards based learning activities in the chat as we deep dive through the fifth grade econ standards. And as always, if you can think of other ways that they can be linked together for a more thematic, immersive, and most valuable learning experience, please keep those in mind and share those out. So, there are a few things that we really need to have a foundational understanding of that led up to the revolution in terms of our econ aspect. So, if we're looking at the Townsend Acts, the Stamp Act, and the Boston Tea Party, students really need to have this foundational knowledge to understand why these things happened, thinking about their understanding of cause and effects. So, the cause of the Stamp Act was, of course, in France and Great Britain disputing over North American land, and that led to the Seven Years' War. Well, the war itself, as the effect, nearly doubled the British national debt from 75 million pounds in 1756 to 133 million pounds in 1763. So, as a result, again, the British Parliament wanted to retrieve that money back. So they created the Stamp Act to be able to help pay for the colonies that were or those stationed in the colonies. The colonists were then required to pay a tax according to Parliament, which was represented by a stamp on papers, playing cards, and documents. The colonists, of course, did not like this, so they responded with violent protests. And here goes our saying, no taxation without representation. To the same extent, shortly after, we have the Townshend Acts. So the American colonies were expensive for the British Parliament to run. So in 1767, they were looking for new ways to be able to initiate more money and more revenue. So they passed once again a new act, the Townshend Acts, which were initiating the taxes that also were placed on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The colonists organized boycotts of these British goods to force the Parliament to repeal the act itself. The tensions grew between the colonists and the British troops during this time, which led, as an effect, to the Boston Massacre. By April of 1770, Parliament repealed all taxes except the Tea Act. So here we go with the Boston Tea Party, once again leading up cause and effect. The American colonies were frustrated by the continued tax on tea. So 3 years after the Townshend Acts were repealed, the colonists dumped the 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. So the Boston Tea Party of 1773 again demonstrated that the American colonies would not tolerate taxation without representation. King George III, by this point, decided to respond by implementing even more acts the coercive acts. Really going to be looking at how to compare the benefits and costs of governmental and individual choices that led up to the American Revolution, hence why we needed that foundational knowledge. So, one of the greatest ways that we always love to get students involved is to have them truly feel like they're living the experience. So, the best way to do that within a classroom setting is, of course, to act it out, to take on that role and truly look at yourself in the perspective of the person that you are trying to act as. So, Stamp Act, the skit, you can have students implement or act out the implementation of the Stamp Act. Have students take on the roles of King George III and the Prime Minister George Grenville, discussing the British debt and how they were going to handle it after the Seven Years' War. You can also then go ahead and include how, in a second act, that was happening in Boston, where students are looking at the perspectives of Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry during this time as a result of the new tax. But even as an extension or an alternate perspective skit altogether, have students act out and even create their own dialogue as to the perspective of the colonists that are living with these imposed acts that are being brought in from England who are not there. They are not receiving that representation, but yet they are getting that taxation. So have them act out how the colonists would feel in the New England, middle, and southern colonies. And lastly, you can also have them do a revolutionary timeline. So, again, starting with the Seven Years' War, you can have students create a timeline of the major events leading up to the American Revolution with a focus on the financial implications that are brought on or attributing to each. So, major aspects to hit are, of course, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Coercive Acts, and the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And of course, we can't forget the printing press. So you could have students read all about one of the greatest resources that we have is National Geographic that offers wonderful free educational materials. So you can have students read the article Regional Economy and the American Revolution. In this article, there it talks about the printing press. It talks about how that was brought on during the Stamp Act of 1765. It talks about how the printing press unified the 13 British colonies and made them stronger in their willpower against British rule. And you can also talk about how that in the printing press, in that increased communication led to different networks where people were all of a sudden coming together from all the different colonies and increasing their trade as well. So some texts that go ahead and follow along are George versus George, hitting again on the Prime Minister and George Washington. Then you could have a kid's guide to the American Revolution, the history of the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party, and how did tea and taxes spark a revolution, all of which have a wonderful financial and econ perspective. The next one is all about colonial resources. So, in this objective, you can identify resources used to produce goods and services within the colonial settlements. So, we already know that from prior knowledge all the way down to kindergarten that goods and services and local production all of are based to what our economy is and how we are then building upon what we have or importing in what we need, creating new things and trading, and it all leads from there. So for this one, we really want to dive in and look at what is a natural resource within the New England, middle, and southern colonies. So, for this, you want students to be able to examine each colony and how they relied on the natural resources of the area in order to thrive. You can have the students complete a research quest to examine the differences in climate and environment of each colony. You can then create a chart for students to record their findings and to begin synthesizing predictions on what products each colony were successful in producing, which then hits upon our further standard on 5 Eco 4A. So, of course, we know New England, we want students to say that they had a large lumber industry because of the forests that were there, but they also had whaling because of the coastal implications in fishing. In the middle colony, they had deep, rich soil and sheltered harbors, which made it very nice in order to be able to get boats in and out, to be able to transport goods. And they had deep rivers that, once again, boats could use for transportation. And then the southern colonies were really focused on coastal plains, Piedmont areas, and farming. So here's just a quick overview, which is a wonderful resource for all of us to just remember what products were most populated and most created and produced within each colony, and then the industries that, as an effect, came into formation. For the next one, you could also be looking at colonial trade movement. And you're going to see this one again in a later time. And there is a great graphic that goes along with it. For this one, we really want students examining a map of the colonial trade movement between the North American colonies, Africa, the West Indies, and Great Britain, and how they were bringing in and importing and exporting those goods that they needed, and how they were exporting the ones that they didn't, or that they were able to produce, and building their trade in this manner, and how they all supported each other. And you're going to see another standard later that talks all about the interdependence of the colonies. And so all of these things come together in order to make the colonies successful and deliver everything that the colonists needed at the time. You'll see the graph on the next section. For another option to have is, again, there's Newsella. Newsella had a great article called Geography of the 13 Colonies. You can have the students read and annotate the differences between those colonies and then record what the resources each settlement had. So here you go. Here is a great graphic that you can use, brought to us by National Geographic, where you can clearly see what was flowing in what direction. Great Britain was sending in manufactured goods, textiles, furniture, and luxuries, while the colonies were sending to Great Britain the lumbers, the fur, the dried fish, whale oil, iron, gunpowder, rice, tobacco, indigo, all of those things that were coming out of the colonies. And you can look at it as well within the trade between Africa and the West Indies. So you can have students analyze this map. For colonial trade as well, it's important for students, again, to understand the different areas of that specialization. So here you're seeing the colonial trade movement, again, in looking at that map. So again, building upon the knowledge that the colonists were able to produce and they had resources, but they didn't have all of their needs met. So that's when they started seeing what they could be most successful at and what they could trade with other countries in different areas in order to also get the supplies that they needed. For this one as well, when we're looking at the different areas of specialization and trade within individuals and businesses within the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies, one of the things that students can do is called colonial products. So students can perform a research quest to determine which products each of the three colonies produced from their natural resources by drawing upon knowledge of the climate and natural resources in 5 Eco 3A. So again, building on that last standard, and again, you can use that map where students are able to see what was coming out of the 13 colonies as a whole. But then you could also provide students with a blank map of the colonial or the original colony, original colonies, and a legend of the resources that they will be placing. So almost like a sorting activity that you would do in a younger grade. However, now you have a blank map and you have the different resources that are available, and you can have students either draw on and use that legend to create a beautiful map of the resources that are available. So again, drawing upon that information and what the colonies are producing. So here you go. Here's an example. Notice how Maine is on this map that is provided. However, Maine was not a colony at this time, so it is not listed as a New England colony. It was in fact part of Massachusetts. And some texts that go along, we have Life of the Colonies, which is a primary source reader, The Scoop on Clothes, Homes, and Daily Life in Colonial America, The Dish on Food and Farming in Colonial America, and you'll see this text again later because it hits upon another standard. If you were a kid in the 13 colonies, this book is intended for a younger audience. However, students truly do enjoy the vivid imagery and the simplistic realizations and information that is provided in this text, even at a fifth grade level. And then I loved this breakdown of this series that we have at the bottom here. The New England colonies, A Place for Puritans, the Middle colonies, Breadbasket of the New World, and the Southern colonies, first and last of 13, all of which touch on the economy in the colonies, the local the local products, all of the resources that they had available, and the trade that they needed. So for the next one is all about the African diaspora movement and the influence that it had within the colonial times and on econ. So for this one, there's a great article on Newsella, and I found that the easier it was to convey this information was through having students really read and annotate articles that were about this time and the influence that was given and the skills that were brought to the colonies. So the first one is a Newsella article. It's called America's Early Economy Was Built on Cotton and Slavery. So while it does touch on slavery as well, it is all intertwined with econ and the economy, because without that trade and that, or excuse me, without that labor at that time, the Southern colonies and the other colonies would not have flourished to the ability that they did. So for this one, there are a few discussion questions that touch right back in. So you might want to consider, what skills did the African movement bring in the African diaspora movement bring that benefited the Southern economy, all of which is listed in the article. And then again, what influence did the African diaspora movement have on the colony? So this should all revolve around a discussion of how the skills were brought in, how they had a great knowledge and wealth of farming information that they were able to do. They were wonderful with art, agriculture, and that allowed those Southern colonies, through the very cheap labor, to thrive and to prosper. Because if you think about it again, in England at that time, there wasn't a lot of wealth. So people were wanting to recreate the stately homes that the English and the British Isles had. So they were creating the Southern plantations and an abundance of acreage, and they needed to be able to drive income off of it. And they wanted to create the same, or better rather, financial gains that they could have here versus back in England. So all of it is connected. And lastly, we have another article called Africans in Colonial America. And this one comes to us from National Geographic. And again, the articles and the questions all relate back to, what skills did this African diaspora movement benefit the the Southern colonies in the economy, and then what influence did it have? So again, bringing it back to agriculture and how it thrived and how it prospered. So just a few books, and the first one you have seen on the last slide as well, because it's all intertwined. All of the more that we can make these objectives in these different standards come together and merge into an immersive experience, the better. Another one that was wonderful was Slavery and the African American Story, which touches upon the original roots of the economy building in the South and why this movement became so popular at that time. African Americans in the colonies, building a new land, and not as related, but chains, which we all know and love, which truly leads up to the American Revolution. And it's a great perspective as someone who is involved in that movement to be able to share their story of the British rule and the American rule and how they were coming together. So for our next one, it's all about colonial coinage and the currency. So one of the issues that the colonists first had was that they had brought coinage from England, but the currency was very quickly sent back to Europe in order to pay for the supplies that they were needing to import from Europe at that time. So England decided that they were not going to supply the colonists with any more coinage and any more currency. So they did not have enough. There was not a sufficient amount. So England decided that they were going to forbid the colonists, just to make it a wee bit harder, from making their own coinage. So without enough money, the colonists had to barter for goods or use other currency like the wampum or nails and tobacco and things that they could trade in order to get what they needed. So that's foundational knowledge, all leads up to understanding the role of money and currency in colonial America. So one of the fun things that we always like to do is play the Price is Right. So a game that you could truly immerse students in, that's very quick and easy to set up, is divide the class into equal teams to play the Price is Right. You can provide each team with a different amount of currency, have the team examine the piece of currency to determine how much it is worth and other characteristics that they notice about the coin. So if they're looking at a primary source and they're looking at what this looked like in the coins, in the paper, that money that was used, they can start to draw connections and notice the difference in do a compare and contrast in regards to the currency that we have today. So on a Venn diagram, you can have the students compare that piece of currency they are holding to the currency, again, that we use today, either coins or bills. Once completed, you can have the students hold up cards with hold up cards with a colonial product on it and a listed price. So you are giving them the price. Have students or teams call out if they believe that they have the correct currency to pay for the product. All teams participate then in a class discussion as to the accuracy of the determination. So it's looking at products that were used during the colonial era. This would be great to touch upon the resources that they had and the trade that had to exist. You can even create a trade scenario, pretending that some people are representing Europe and some people are representing Africa or the West Indies or the colonies themselves. And then again, examining that money and the currency at that time. So you could also pretend that there is money in colonial times, which, excuse me, is offered. It's actually an article by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia that you can easily Google. In this article, it's giving students an opportunity to gain an understanding of colonial coins. So the colonial paper money and the quest for a national coin are all included in this article. So students can then read and annotate why paper money was more commonly used during the colonial era. And then, of course, consumption and trade with British America. Again, another article on Newsela that students can read and annotate with essential questions that are all focused on the currency and how they were used within the colony. So, how did the lack of standardized currency in the colonies hinder trade between them? Again, going back to our knowledge of that foundational knowledge that we just discussed in England, not allowing them to make more or to create their own at this time. What were some of the concerns raised by the rise of consumerism in colonial America? And how did colonial Americans use credit to purchase goods from British merchants? And for our next one, we really are focusing on the interdependence between the three colonies and how they supported each other, or the three areas of colonies, rather. So, when examining the interdependence of the original 13, it is important to note that they operated unlike the United States today. So, while there were 13, they were not fully separate. They were very independent on each other, and they were not like the way that we are now, where we are one united body. So, just for an example of great graphic of who relied on who. So, the New England colonies had soil that was difficult to farm. So, they relied on the Mid Atlantic colonies to for grains and livestock. And they traded with the Southern colonies for tobacco, rice, cotton, and indigo plant. For the Mid Atlantic colonies, they were capable of producing their own crops, but they weren't industrialized. So, they relied on the New England colonies for farming tools and equipment and the southern colonies for all the other crops that they could not grow an abundance of and cotton. For the southern colonies, which were not industrialized, they focused on farming. They looked to New England colonies for farming tools and equipment, and the mid Atlantic colonies for grains and other crops that they didn't grow an abundance of. So here we can do, once again, acting it out. We always want to make the students really immerse themselves in those perspectives. So you can divide the class into three teams or colonies, acting as the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. You can have students recall the resources they learned about in 5 Eco 3A and generate a list of what they can offer the other colonies and what they need so that they can produce on their own to their climate, their geography, and their skills. So in a version of Who Has, which we've all played, you can have students trade with other colonies to meet all of their predetermined needs to be a thriving colonial settlement. So again, you can have those conversations ahead of time, or you could provide a class with a list of what each colony needs, have them generate the idea of what they can produce, and then they're going to have to identify what colony that they would need to get that information or get those products from to be able to trade. So, our fifth grade vocabulary is all about bringing upon those words that we've had since our foundation in kindergarten. The first one is revolution, taxation, interdependence, resource goods, property, colonial, tax, natural resource, services, colonies, settlements, ration, trade, costs, specialization, exchange, supply, government, and benefits. And as always, we have now seen the conclusion of our K through 5 econ standards, where we're looking at and building upon all of the vocab going back all the way to kindergarten when we were talking about goods and services in our local community. And now we are building in that United States first bit of history with leading up to the American Revolutionary War. Any questions?